I've brought up the Desert Fathers, and your book, especially in the final chapters, draws on them quite a bit. And what do the Desert Fathers have to teach us about chastity?
The literature of the Desert Fathers comes to us in two forms. We have the lives of the fathers, which are mainly quite brief sketches of their vocation, of their ascetic struggle, and of their teaching. But primarily, we have the sayings of the Desert Fathers, which are short snippets of conversations, mostly in dialogical form, where you have a young or a younger, inexperienced monk coming to an older, experienced monk, or a young, inexperienced nun to an older, experienced nuns, because we have we hear the voices of both men and women in this tradition,
Hmm.
asking very concrete questions. And one of the interesting things about the sayings of the Desert Fathers is that it's entirely it's remarkable in its frankness, its sincerity, and its want of complexes in stating difficulties in chastity, in talking about temptations, in talking about fantasies, in talking about even sort of obsessive thoughts.
Hmm.
And the fathers and the mothers provide extremely cogent, experiential, and time-tried theological and spiritual advice, which is also advice that promotes human flourishing. So one of the great riches of this tradition is precisely that it deals very realistically with real issues. I found this again and again and again using these texts, to teach novices or to give talks to both secular and religious audiences, or sometimes in spiritual direction. And I've again and again found people being astonished at finding such forthrightness in such ancient texts, because we have a tendency to think that ancient texts are perforce solemn and remote and world weary. Whereas here we have really the stuff of experience and very, very recognizable topics, problems, and still applicable good advice.
Do you have a favorite saying or anecdote from the Desert Fathers bearing specifically on chastity?
I think there is that story which I cite in the book, which I think is a very important one, of a young man who has, he's left secular life, he's gone into the desert, he's begun his monastic apprenticeship, and he tries to pray, he tries to be serious, but he finds that he carries a lot of baggage, remembrance, and he finds that there are lustful thoughts that keep invading his prayers and keep invading his pious exercises, and they're a distraction to him, and they discourage him. So he does exactly the right thing. He goes to an experienced old monk, his confessor, and says, "Father, listen, I've got these thoughts, and they trouble me." So he speaks his thoughts, and the old man is scandalized and responds with anger. And he says, "Listen, young man, if you have thoughts like that, if you let your prayers be contaminated by such distractions, you're not worthy of the monastic habit, and you're not worthy of this life. Out with you." So
Hmm.
off this young fellow goes, discouraged, downhearted, thinking, "Oh, so it's true then that I am, on account of these things that inhabit me, good for nothing." So he resolves to, well, I mean, he hasn't got a choice really. He follows the advice he's been given in obedience and sets off back to the city. But fortunately, on his way back to the city, he meets another monk who is familiar to us from the corpus of the sayings, a monk called Apollos, who is graced with that capacity that the best and the most authentic of the fathers have, of being able to read in the hearts of others, of being able to see and sense what other people are going through. So he meets this young man on the road, sees that he is carrying a heavy load, and says, "Brother, what's wrong? What's weighing you down? I can see that you're carrying something heavy." And the young man, who's just been humiliated, hesitates, doesn't really particularly want to share this because he doesn't want to risk being humiliated again. But then Apollos wins his confidence, and the young man tells him what has happened, and Apollo says to him, "Listen, this is nothing to be discouraged and certainly no ground for hopelessness. Our way to purity goes through impurity, and we've got to deal with what we carry, and we've got to deal also with the temptations of the demons that are round about us trying to trip us up and to attack where we're most vulnerable." And he says, the only way of being victorious through this battle is to throw yourself upon the mercy of God and to do what you've just done, to open your heart in honesty to another. So don't be discouraged. There is hope for you, and this is no reason to leave your vocation behind. Just wait for me here until tomorrow, and we'll see what can be done about this. And so the young man thinks that Apollos is trustworthy and decides to heed this advice he's been given. And then Apollos does something magnificent. He takes his staff, and then he goes to the cell of the first old monk, the confessor whom the young man had first gone to see. And he takes up position outside his cell, and he prays a very audacious prayer. And he says, "Almighty God, teach this foolish old man what the length of years has not taught him, and transfer my young brother's temptation on to this inexperienced old man, that he may learn humility and learn the extent of your grace." This prayer is heard, and the next thing that happens is that the other old man comes screaming out of his cell because he can't endure this strength of temptation even for 1 minute, and is about to abandon everything, even after decades in the desert, precisely in order to run back to the city. At which point, Apollos trips him up and says, "Listen, I'll tell you what's been going on." And he says, "Until this point, the devil, the enemy of mankind, has clearly not thought you worthy of temptation." It's a magnificent example of ascetic sarcasm. The implication being, you've been living such a mediocre life that you haven't really needed to be tried. But now, let this experience teach you what all these years you've wasted on living in mediocrity, namely that only the grace of God can heal our impurities and heal our wounds and lead us to integrity, to chastity and sanctity. So it's a parable. It's a parable of how it is possible to live even in a protected and a privileged environment without really coming to genuine self-knowledge. And it's a parable and a kind of a prophecy even of how no temptation is beyond the reach of healing grace, provided there is humility, sincerity, and genuine trust in God.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's such a beautiful story.
In the literature of the fathers, we are constantly given examples of just the importance of remaining grounded in humility, of remaining grounded in a healthy distrust of self, of not giving in to the illusion that I've got it all settled.
Right.
Newman says something wonderful about this, sort of a provocative statement, which he once gave in a university sermon, when he says, to be something like, to be safe is to be at risk. Once I think I've got it all sorted out, that I've got it all under my belt, that I'm beyond the reach of temptation of falling, that's exactly when I'm likely to trip. So
Right.
the important thing is to remain grounded in that knowledge of my own fragility, but also entertaining that utter trust that God can save me in any circumstance, if I let myself be saved.